Welcome to the podcast review for the Chapter 6.4 and 6.5 quiz coming up soon. This will help you get ready for it. Hopefully you already have your study guide partially or mostly filled out. If not, you'll be able to get most of the answers while following through here. We'll start off with the Man on the Moon investigation, talking about what questions from the quiz are going to be on there. The first part of the success guide says the amount of the lit side of the moon decides what blank we see on Earth. And of course the answer there is phase. The next one was what happens to the amount of light from new moon to full moon. When we look at it, the amount we see increases. Remember that half the moon is lit all the time. However, the amount we see is what changes. We saw it in the Man on the Moon investigation as you moved the styrofoam ball around the Earth. The next question is why do we see the same side of the moon? We always see the same side of the moon because the moon rotates one time for every time it revolves. If you look here, you can see the quarter with the pennies going around it, that it is pointing, the head of the penny always faces inward towards it, just like the moon revolving and rotating one time as it goes around. Remember, it's 27.3 days that it takes to do that. The next item on there is during which two phases is the amount of light we see on the moon the same. There are actually three sets of phases that occurs at: the crescents, the gibbous, and the quarters. If we look at the picture here, we can see the crescents have the same amount of light, the gibbous have the same amount of light, and the quarters have the same amount of light. The new and the full are the only two that don't have a matching pair to go with that. And also, we do want to make notice of this. The white is the part that is seen from Earth. It's very important when you look at pictures of the moon that you know which one you're going to be looking at. So in this case, you can see the waxing crescent. You can see the white part lit up on the right-hand side, while the left part of the moon is still dark. Very, very important to see which one is which. We pointed out directly on the quiz, so make sure you pay attention to that. The next one was, what do we call the different shapes of the moon? That's pretty simple, it's just phases. And then the last one, or almost last one there, the blank and blank of the moon take the same amount of time. And that, of course, is at 27.3 days, so therefore it has to be rotation and revolution. Remember, the rotation and revolution of the moon take the same amount of time, and that's why we always see the Man on the Moon facing towards us. The last part of the Man on the Moon investigations stuff that's on the quiz was it says to draw each of the phases of the moon on the back of this sheet and label them. As you can see here, we have the first quarter the waxing crescent. Those are, of course, on the right hand side lit up. Then we have the new moon, which is fully darkened, waning crescent on the left, third quarter lit up on the left half of the moon, the waning gibbous where most of the moon is visible, but however it's getting smaller because it's waning, the full moon, and the waxing gibbous. Again, just to remind you, the white is the part that is seen from Earth in all these pictures. So it's very important, again, to remember which one is which. This matches up to how we drew it also in our investigations. Now, for the eclipse investigation, few topics on there as well. First one is explain how a solar eclipse happens. Solar eclipse happens when the moon is directly between the Earth and the sun. You can see in this diagram here, we have the sun rays coming towards the Earth. However, the moon has passed into those rays and created an umbra and a penumbra. Remember, those are the shadows that are then cast on Earth. The next one was during which phase can a lunar eclipse take place? Remember, eclipses only happen when they're in a straight line, so therefore it has to be in a full moon, because a lunar eclipse is when the moon is in the Earth's shadow, so therefore it'd be a full moon. And you can see in this diagram here, we have the sun shining again towards the Earth, and then you can see the moon has moved into the umbra of the Earth, and so therefore you can see that that is going on. The next one is, why is a solar eclipse less likely to be seen than a lunar eclipse? Again, if you think about it, the moon's umbra covers a much smaller area on the Earth's surface. When you compare it, we used a 3-inch styrofoam ball to represent the moon and a 12-inch globe, and that is actually a true ratio of their sizes. One creates a much larger shadow than the other. It's kind of like trying to compare the shadows between your house and the Empire State Building. One is going to create a bigger shadow, so therefore you can be in the shadow more often. You can also see in this diagram here a comparison of that. You can see that the Earth or the moon shadow is very, very small and has a very small area. It's a very little spot they can see it. In class I talked about that you can see a solar eclipse in Mexico and then not see it in Fort Wayne. However, if there's a lunar eclipse going on, you're going to see it on the entire part of the hemisphere that's experiencing it. So the next thing for eclipse is looking at only within the moon's umbra can you see a blank eclipse. That's of course a solar eclipse. Remember, the moon's umbra is the part that is the darkest part, and it's the shadow from the moon. The next one is, what is the darkest part of the shadow called? And that is the umbra. We can see in this diagram here the umbra coming from the moon during a solar eclipse, and it is blocking out a portion of the light from hitting the Earth's surface. Then we have to talk about how are lunar and solar eclipses different. You may actually want to make this table in the back that I'm going to show in a second, but if we first look at the drawings of the two types of eclipses, we can see that there are some very important differences. First of all, the order is very different. For a lunar eclipse, you go Sun, Earth, and Moon, and then for a solar eclipse, it goes Sun, Moon, and Earth. The other big difference is what's actually being blocked. In a lunar eclipse, the light is being blocked from hitting the moon, whereas in a solar eclipse, light is being blocked from hitting the Earth. Very, very big differences there. Make sure you understand what they are and can describe them. The last topic on the eclipse is, why doesn't a lunar eclipse happen every full moon? And this is because of the tilt of the moon's orbit. Remember, we looked at this diagram and we're able to see that the Earth's orbit is like a flat table, and then there's another tilted table that the moon orbits on that's slightly different from the Earth's orbit. And because of that, they don't always line up in a perfectly straight line. Sometimes the moon's higher, sometimes it's lower, and that's why we can get a full moon without having a lunar eclipse, or a new moon without having a solar eclipse. Let's move on to the last investigation for this quiz, and that is the high and low. When we take a look at this, the first question is, when are the tides highest? And that is when the Earth, Moon, and Sun are in a nearly straight line, which is also called a spring tide. We can see in this diagram here, you can see that they have the bulge occurring on the waters in the ocean as they're being pulled towards the moon and the sun at the same time. And it creates this just slight bulge, which creates the higher tides. Of course, that also means it creates an extreme low tide at the same time, because those spots that are not having the bulge at them are actually lower than normal. Next one is, what causes tides? Tides are caused by differences in how much the sun's and the moon's gravities pull on the different parts of Earth. We looked at that in the investigation as we used the models to compare the different tide levels. And when you have the sun and the moon pulling on it, both of them pull just enough to start showing an effect of getting a little bit more of an increase of water in different areas. Next one is, when do neap tides occur? And that's when the sun is at a right angle to the moon. And we can see in this diagram here, there are actually two phases where that happens at. Those are the first and third quarter. That's when the sun and moon are at right angles to each other, which means that you are having the forces kind of pulling on each other to try to keep them the same. You can think of it almost like trying to keep a rubber band, and when you try to straighten it out or get it into a perfect circle, you have to pull on it at right angles in order to get it to match out. If you just pull it on two opposite ends, you get to stretch out instead. Then we can take a look at the next one here, which says, which tide has the least distance between low and high tides? Again, that is going to be a neap tide. That is when they are at the right angles to each other, and so therefore we don't get the extremes. And then the next one is, why are spring tides the highest? That is because the moon and sun are in a straight line and pulling in the same or opposite directions. We can see it again in this diagram. When they're pulling in the same or opposite directions, we get a larger pull of gravity. It's just like if you take the rubber band and you pull on just one side of it or pull on both sides of it, but in a straight line, you're going to get it to bulge in one direction. The same thing happens with the Earth's ocean. The last thing I want to go through are some questions to do in the book. On page 218, questions 15, 16, 17, 19, 20, and 21 are very important questions, as well as on page 219, questions 1 and 5. Again, this was the podcast review for chapter 6.4 and 6.5 quiz coming up soon. I do encourage you to make sure you study with your parents, ask questions in class, or jump onto My Big Campus and ask them on there. Remember, as we told you, this quiz does have a lot more stuff on it. You can see the study guide is much longer. But I'm looking forward to seeing how well you guys do, because I know you did a great job in the last one, and I look forward to seeing the same. Again, if you have questions, My Big Campus, or you can ask them in class.